Life in the rock and roll fast lane with Eagles guitarist Joe Walsh during the late 80s was an insidious slide into addiction for the rocker and his stripper girlfriend. 20-year-old Kristin Casey. Casey first met the 40-year-old rock musician at the Radisson Hotel in her hometown of Austin, Texas, where he played the court jester doing the moonwalk and then snorting a plate of cocaine that she passed on. But in that moment a voice in her head told her that this was the man she was meant to marry. He was her soulmate. Or so she envisioned. At their second meeting, she was hot for him and kicked off her shoes, leapt in bed and waited for him to jump her. Not so fast. He was holding back and wanted them to look at each other reflected in the bathroom mirror in candlelight. I bit my tongue for the rest of the night, not saying what I was thinking. Can we please FK normally now? Author Casey writes in her explosive new book, Rock Monster: My Life with Joe Walsh, published by Rare Bird Books, a Barnacle book. Casey, a stripper from Austin, hooked up with Joe Walsh in the late 1980s for a 6-year wild ride through debauched drug and booze addictions that finally drove them apart. The man had abandoned the universal, tried-and-true baseball diamond method: pet, grope, penetrate, school. This bathroom mirror ST was practically un-American, she writes. Getting that out of the way on their second meeting, Casey didn't know whether to expect mirror weirdness or passionate. Instead, I had my first bondage lesson, she writes. Toot had twosomes, threesomes, lesbians, gay men, one-night stands, and bought and paid for. One of my lovers had been a crack-smoking cross-dresser who'd introduced me to the joys of the anal intruder kit. Casey said she was ignorant of bondage BDSM but intrigued. Say please, he instructed. Casey writes of her BDSM experience with Walsh. When I did, I'd be pinched, caressed, or presented with things to kiss and lick. Casey, however, found it unerotic and boring. She had left home at 17 and tried everything from intravenous meth binging to smack and nearly died. Cocaine made her crazy and suppressed her own high-powered drive. Casey thought she had seen it all until she met Walsh, who wasn't consuming more drugs than the typical rock musician but was an alcoholic who chugged double vodka screwdrivers. Once he needed 3 days to sleep it all off, she claims. While she was at the strip club Sugar's in her hometown of Austin, Walsh retrieved a pair of her panties from the dirty clothes hamper and confessed to taking a whiff of them. Why? She asked. I missed you, he told her. It was during their first long weekend together and the extent of their intimacy was inhaling each other's personal scents from a distance. They grew closer with his visits from Los Angeles and she started going out to the coast. Their life was still awkward and she often tried to seduce him and interrupt his habit of staying up late and writing song lyrics on yellow legal pads while drinking vodka screwdrivers and ignoring her. He eventually yielded and played with her Wally in the underground parking garage, then stripped her naked on the roof and tied her naked to the penthouse balcony while doing bumps of cocaine. The nightly playtime was an improv circus and now she started meeting him as he played gigs around the country. He lived in a world without rules. It was his own world and she would have followed him to Siberia. The scene was seductive. First-class airline flights, free champagne, chauffeurs waiting for her in different cities holding a sign with her name on it, and the pre-show cuddle, drinks and lines of coke, maybe a whole gram. Casey writes. After the show, they repeated the pre-game before having wild playtime. Would it be passionate or bondage? That was always the looming question. But their drug consumption was getting dangerous. Casey writes. She mistakenly thought I'd never let drugs come between me and the man I loved. Casey had once been a meth addict and vowed not to return to those days. Despite her love of being high, she did, however, join Walsh in what he called monstering, snorting voluminous amounts of cocaine. BDSM, bondage, discipline, dominance and submission was the only kind of Walsh was really interested in. But Casey could only turn on to his style of kink with cocaine. Casey writes that a trip to Los Angeles was a big awakening for the young girl from Austin. Walsh needed more vodka and more kink. Casey writes, and vowed to keep up with his needs, which called for tying her naked to a balcony after inserting a slice of dripping melon into her butt crack. When she was high on drugs, he viewed Casey's alter ego as an airheaded valley girl who launched into spontaneous rants. She quit talking when she saw it taking her over, but as their relationship continued, Casey's bondage fantasies weren't satisfying her drive and she asked him if she could have with another guy while he was in the room. Casey had been swallowed up in Walsh's decadent world 24-hour drug binges. And a kink scene that wasn't satisfying her own urges. She also missed stripping and being put on a pedestal. Her self-confidence came from the wild stripping arena where she had been so successful, but Casey had no confidence in the fast-paced scene of movie stars Walsh knew in Los Angeles and was mute when Sean Penn, Harry Dean Stanton and Harry Nilsson dropped by to visit. One Christmas back in Austin, Walsh showered her with gifts that included clothing that Fleetwood Mac's Stevie Nicks had given him during their time on tour together. "We were pretty high most of the time," was his explanation of why Nicks gave him girls' clothing. "That's kind of why we broke up." Stevie Nicks came back to the house one night. She didn't do any drugs but kept misplacing a handful of jewels she had with her. She landed on the piano bench and played until they finally got her to step outside the door where her driver took over and got her in the car and drove her home. Casey viewed the one-time queen of rock and roll who sang some of the biggest chart toppers with Fleetwood Mac as ridiculously ditzy. Walsh would eventually propose to Casey. But the deal was he wanted a child. Motherhood wasn't something Casey ever thought about. But Walsh had a daughter named Emma Kristin who was killed in a car accident on her way to nursery school, an event that haunted Walsh for years. He viewed the fact that his new girlfriend and his now deceased little girl had the same name was some kind of message that he was spiritually linked to Casey. He also wanted another baby, so Walsh suggested they move in together only when she got her cocaine habit under control. Casey's cocaine habit was so extreme that it had opened a hole in her septum when she couldn't snort through her nose. Casey and Walsh packed straws with cocaine and tried blowing it up each other's behinds, giving her septum a rest. Walsh had been married 3 times. Casey's longest relationship was 4 months, not getting enough satisfaction in their life. Casey slid into affairs and started with Walsh's road manager, Smokey Wendell, who had witnessed drugs killing comedian John Belushi. Walsh agreed to Casey having affairs but only if he picked the man and he wanted to watch. That wasn't quite what she had in mind. So Casey would chose her own lovers out of sight of Walsh. They did have a threesome with a Estonian oil rig worker in the bathroom of a plane en route to Japan. But it only increased her ardor for other men who would satisfy her intense wild desires. Walsh was having his own affairs and Casey found the evidence in his trouser pockets when doing the laundry. Fights followed and then they'd make up and acknowledge they truly loved each other. Lionel Richie agreed to marry them but Walsh was reluctant until she got her drug consumption under control. It was then that Casey replaced cocaine with crack that she smoked with abandon, giving her nose a rest. But Walsh was bored. And Casey was boozing more. She blamed him, hated him and loved him, or thought she did, while consuming more crack. And in time Casey fell into a losing pattern of accommodating Walsh's kinky desires. Walsh joined Ringo Starr and his all-star band on tour, and Ringo and his wife Barb tried to get Casey into rehab. They had successfully done rehab together themselves. It worked. But Casey was too stoned to agree to a stay in a rehabilitation center in the middle of the desert. Walsh had suggested she find something she wanted to do, like going back to college. He was sympathetic and hoped that she would find something that would fulfill her. Casey had been enrolled in a community college in Austin when she first met Walsh. But as years went by, she wasn't willing to give up the rockstar lifestyle and couldn't extract herself from the scene and drugs. Terrible physical fights with Walsh followed and he escaped to the road, but not after he chased her through the house, both landing vicious blows. When the Eagles approached Walsh about rejoining them on tour, it was with a proviso that had to go into rehab to get sober. Casey saw this as the end of their relationship, which was too toxic to survive. When Walsh went to rehab, Casey quit doing drugs but started drinking and contemplated suicide. She writes, "She started stripping again and drinking cheap wine, some 8 to 10 drinks between 9 a.m. and noon, and another 8 to 10 to maintain the drunken state." Casey finally hit rock bottom and she entered Alcoholics Anonymous, where she learned to care about her own life and made friends going through similar experiences. Once they were both clean and sober, Casey and Walsh had a brief reunion. They knew they loved each other, but acknowledged that the relationship was officially over. Their love was a distant memory and both had moved on. Casey returned to Austin, where she now works in the field of therapy as an intimacy coach and addiction specialist.
Where the freaks at?